So I'm going to talk a bit about the Autopilot today in the Twin Otter Extended. Most people, when you get this aircraft, they find the Autopilot a little bit difficult to get to grips with because it's unconventional. It has many of the regular features of most autopilots, but some of the modes work in unfamiliar ways. In particular, there's no vertical speed control in the Twin Otter Extended, and people find that difficult. We're going to look at that in particular today, and a couple of enhancements I've made to the Autopilot in my cockpit to make that easier to work with. Now, the main problem it causes not having vertical speed control is over initiating an ascent or a descent. So we'll just look at how you do those things conventionally, and then we'll look at the enhancements I've made to make things work a little bit easier. Of course, we can't see anything now. So we're flying straight and level on autopilot. We're in altitude hold. There's no obvious way to initiate a climb. Normally in an aircraft with a more conventional autopilot, you just go to the vertical speed control and dial the vertical speed up into a positive value and you'd start to climb. We don't have that in the Twin Otter. One of the things that confuses people initially is the elevator trim control has no effect when you're flying on autopilot. Now, the basic way to initiate a climb is there's a thing called a pitch and turn panel, which is on the centre of the yoke pedestal, and there's a thumb wheel which helps us, which allows us to nudge the attitude, also the bank angle. Now, I've got that in my cockpit set up on some push buttons instead of a thumb wheel and a dial. But if I press my pitch up push button, in fact if I press and hold it, a couple of things happen. First of all, the altitude hold mode is cancelled if you look at the autopilot panel. Secondly, if you look at the ADI, the flight director is indicating a 10-degree pitch up. Now that's the maximum. You can dial that in. I just tweak with that. I'm reducing it there. I'm going to increase it again. It will increase if I push and hold to a maximum of 10 degrees up. So that's the simplest way to initiate a climb with this particular autopilot. If we level out again by selecting altitude hold, we're going to hold at about 6,400 now. We'll look at the other way to do this. Now, the other way to do this is to use the indicated airspeed hold function, and by holding a particular airspeed and playing with the power, collateral to that we get a change in the climb or descent as the aircraft trims to try and hold that speed. There's no auto throttle in this aircraft, in case I need to say that. Now, that works best in the descent. So we're at cruising speed here, we're doing what, 130 knots. So if I select indicated airspeed hold, you'll see that altitude hold is cancelled. I'm not sure why we always get a pitch up when we first select that. I've got a feeling there's a maximum airspeed that this aircraft can hold, and it's lower than 130 knots, which is where we were flying. But we're on airspeed hold now. If I reduce the power, you should see we get a pitch down, and it's trying to hold about 120 knots, a little bit less than that. And we're going down at 1,000 feet per minute, more or less. Now, if you want to finesse that, you have to basically play with the power settings. So if I want to make that, I'll try and make that 500 feet per minute just by increasing the power somewhat. So you see we get a pitch up there there's going to be some oscillation till it settles down. So we're at 300 feet per minute descent, 400. Ease off a little bit more, try and get that to 500. It's quite difficult to dial that in precisely because we're chasing that vertical speed needle, which is not great. So that's how to do it with airspeed hold. If I put us onto altitude hold again, let us level out. So we're about 5,800 feet leveled out. I'm just going to fly up the coast a bit. We can use that same technique with airspeed hold to initiate an ascent. Now the problem with this is it requires that you're not flying along on full power. If you are, then this option's not available to you, or it's available to you in a very long-winded form. So we're not on full power at the moment. If I select indicated airspeed hold, again we get that pitch up for some reason. And then it's more or less settling down. But I can initiate a climb. It's going to hold us about 105 knots, 103. If I roll on the power, you can get a pitch up. And we should settle about, I don't know, 1,000 feet per minute. Now there is another way we can initiate a climb using this autopilot, and that is we can dial in a higher altitude on the altitude alerter. We're at, what are we at? We're at 6,600. If we dial in 7,500. If you press MDA, this is counterintuitive, minimum descent altitude. What will happen is, let's just turn everything off. Well, we'll stay on heading mode, we'll turn off the vertical mode. Let's just try and get a straight and level. So we're flying about straight and level more or less now. We've dialed in 7,500 on the altitude alerter. If I press minimum descent altitude, what happens is it immediately sets altitude hold mode with a target altitude of 7,500, and because we're below that, it initiates a climb. So that's a very convenient way of starting an ascent using this autopilot. But there's one major thing that's missing, which is a function that really is very convenient. If you cancel all the vertical and horizontal modes in the autopilot, we're on a thing called attitude hold. Now if I turn the autopilot off, I'll just demonstrate this by, if I put the aircraft into a right hand bank and an ascent, if you look at the ADI, that's showing that clearly, and press engage, the autopilot is now holding that attitude. So it's holding the climb, about a 10-degree climb, and a sort of 20 or 15-degree bank. And I can't do anything to get it out of that. If I try, it goes back and holds that attitude. If I just demonstrate that, I'm going to roll it round up off this cloud. So if I put it in a steeper bank and a nose down, it's going to hold that attitude as well. Now the function that's missing, if you look at in the virtual cockpit at the control yoke, there's a button on there labelled CWS, that stands for control wheel steering. What should happen is, and this is not implemented in the Twin Otter Extended, but what should happen is if you press and hold that button while the autopilot is engaged, it should temporarily disconnect the autopilot servos, allow you to position the aircraft where you want it, then you let go of the button and it's in attitude hold mode. And that is probably the most convenient way of initiating a descent or an ascent or a bank that there is, except that it isn't implemented. So what I've done is I've basically rejigged my autopilot to implement that. And all I've done notionally, if I put us back onto altitude hold, let's put us onto heading hold and go in roughly that direction. So what I've done is I've set up one of the buttons on my yoke handle, it's a left hand push button. So when I press that, it mimics the control wheel steering functionality. Now all it actually does is it literally disconnects the autopilot and then reconnects it. And of course the other thing it has to do is, if you've got any vertical or lateral mode selected, it cancels those as well, because otherwise we're not in attitude hold mode. So if I just demonstrate that, I'm flying on autopilot, I'm on heading hold, altitude hold. If I initiate a right hand bank and a descent, let's say, by clicking the control wheel steering button, so there's the bank and there's the descent. If I let go, it's now established attitude hold mode with that attitude. It's cancelled the altitude hold and the heading hold. If I turn us back the other way, now the only thing that's slightly irritating is I can't disconnect the autopilot without getting that warning tone. I don't know if there's a way to suppress that. Maybe there is. I'll explore that a little bit later. So that's control wheel steering, essentially. And that's done with, I mean, I'm using Linda, you're probably aware, to program my controls. So that's done with just a little extra bit of Lua code, which I've done in Linda, but if you're not using Linda, you can do that with straight Lua if you've got FSU IPC, of course. And that's an absolutely transformative addition to the autopilot, really. I mean, it really transforms the way you fly. Even if you don't have a full cockpit like this, you can implement that with a simple button click. You know, almost certainly have a button on your yoke that you can use for that, and it makes the thing much more flyable. Now there's one more enhancement that I've done, which is also which is optional really, but it's also very useful to do. And that is, although I've got separate buttons to implement the pitch and turn panel, as I said, which is on the centre of the yoke pedestal, that's a little bit fiddly. And what you can do, and what I have done, is you can change your elevator trim action to do something different if it detects that you're flying on autopilot. And so what I've done is, in my elevator trim function, now I use the Cytec ProFlight elevator trim wheel, but hacked to act as a rotary encoder. I mean, it is a rotary encoder at heart, but if you use the switch on the yoke or two other buttons to use the electric style elevator trim, you can do the same thing. So I have my elevator trim mapped to two button presses essentially, and what I've done is if I'm flying on autopilot, it does a different thing, and the thing it does is it just calls the function that does the nose pitch down instead of doing the elevator trim. And so if I demonstrate that, I'm on autopilot now, flying on heading hold and altitude hold. If I move the trim wheel down, if you watch the ADI, you should see that go down, and it's cancelled altitude hold mode, of course. Now you can see it incrementally. If I dial the nose down again, you can see it goes a little bit further, and again a little bit further, and so on. It's going to stop at 10 degrees down because that's the limit of the autopilot manual mode controls. And if I start to dial it up again, you can see I'm doing that incrementally, and it will go all the way to 10 degrees pitch up. So that's another enhancement which really adds value to the sim. I'm just over Martins Bay now. We could go down and land at Martins Bay, or we could go back to Milford Sound. I think we'll probably do the latter. We're flying direct to Milford Sound. I'm not sure that's a good idea because we're over some pretty high mountains, but we'll see how it goes. We could fly. Well, we're at 10,000 feet. We should be fine. But it's the descent I'm worried about. We should really descend en route. So if we just try out some of those functions as we go, really. We can, let's just make sure we get everything set up right here. So I'm going to use the control wheel steering just to point us over that way and start a bit of a descent. I'm just looking for, I can see Milford Sound, I can see the water just through that gap in those two peaks, so I'm going to head for that. I'm not actually descending up, I pulled us out of that. And if I finesse that a little bit, we've got 10 miles to run, and we've got 10,000 feet to lose. I think we'll come off autopilot for now and just do this by hand. We can pretty much see where we're going. In fact, Milford Sound's probably just coming into view around the corner there. Be careful, we're going to overspeed here. We are overspeeding. Just for fun, I think we're going to buzz some of these peaks, because why not?